Welcome to the broadcast. For over 4 decades, Arthur Miller has been challenging theatergoers with his personal vision of the basic conflicts in American life. With a body of work including All My Sons, Death of a Salesman, and The Crucible, he has gained a Pulitzer Prize, Emmy, and Tony Awards, and a reputation as one of the great playwrights of our age. His 1968 play, The Price, is currently being treated to an all-star revival at Manhattan's Roundabout Theater, and we are pleased to have Arthur Miller join us now for a conversation about a life in the theater and to share some of his insights about the theater as he sees it today. There is much talk, welcome first of all.
Thank you.
There is much talk today about a revival on Broadway. What do you make of that?
Well, count the plays. There aren't many. It's not a revival, it's that there are a few musicals are making a lot of money. But the sickness is there. I don't see any sign of it going away. It's simply that they opened a couple of hits, right, which were drawn from really the past. They're not new shows.
Guys and Dolls, Most Happy Fellas.
Right. And the Gershwin.
Yeah, Ira Gershwin. Crazy About You, I guess it is.
Right.
Yeah.
But it's this is not a. We don't have a healthy theater because we're not being presented with the issues that you have to resolve in order to create a theater.
And wait a minute, we don't have a healthy theater because we're not being presented with the issues you have to have. Does that mean the playwrights are not presenting us with the issues?
No, the society isn't. You know, the plays come out of a situation. It's no accident that at certain points in history you get a lot of plays. There's a confluence of things that bring about sufficient interest by serious writers in the theater. What we have now is the ultimate development of the market economy as far as the theater is concerned. That is to say, a few shows make a lot of money, and they leave nothing behind them when they close. By that I mean, we don't have a theater culture. We don't have a group of actors gradually developing their art over a period of years, so that you get an Olivier, you get a Richardson, you get any number of absolutely accomplished actors.
And Ian McKellen.
Or Ian McKellen. We get people who are in and out, and they're in and out not because they're not nice people, it's that the situation makes it impossible for an actor to remain in the theater for the most part. There are very few, like George Scott, who will hang around. He'll also have a movie career, which is okay, but he does come back.
But I thought the theater was fueled by writers, not by actors.
Well, it is, but let's confront the situation. How can a writer live in this theater? He can't do it. It's not possible. I have this play on, the Price, and to have a culture, you have to have a past. We don't allow the past into the theater. There are a few revivals now and then. I'm talking about straight plays now, not musicals.
Right.
So that a whole generation grows up and they don't know what happened 10 years ago. And nothing piles up, nothing accrues, nothing develops. We're constantly starting all over again. It's as though you burned all the libraries and all the books.
And what happened? What did we miss? What has to happen for a culture to have
I think what has to happen is very simple. It's what has always happened in the theater, one way or another. The theater, to be a continuous developing thing, has to have support. You can't do it only on the audience. It has never happened. Not in Shakespeare's time, not in the Greeks' time, not in Chekhov's time, Ibsen's time.
Not in Britain today.
And certainly not in Britain today, and not in Sweden, not anywhere where there is a going theater. I just directed Death of a Salesman in Stockholm. They have a theater with 6 stages in it, 90 actors under 365 days a year contracts. And they gradually develop people. I have a Biff in the play who's playing in one of Ingmar Bergman's productions on his days off. He's already been Hamlet. He's done Richard III. He's now Biff. Everybody in that cast has a background that maybe 2 or 3 people in this country have.
A genuine repertory company.
Well, it's
of a sort.
You know, we ask of the theater that it do something that no other institution has to do. If I were going to build airplanes, I don't go out on 46th Street and ask anybody, do you know how to build an airplane? If so, come and we'll talk to you. These people are hired and they're kept there, and they're embedded in an airplane culture. See, we don't do that. Or if you want a baseball team, we don't start the season by saying, okay, everybody who wants to play with the Mets show up at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, and we'll try to pick out a team. Yeah. The result is that when you try to cast a play here, you've got to go to a handful of movie stars who are still interested in playing in the theater.
If you look at Mike Nichols today, he's got Gene Hackman and Richard Dreyfuss and Glenn Close. If you look at Tennessee Williams and Streetcar Named Desire, you've got Alex Baldwin and Jessica Lange.
Well,
and they're going to stay for a small, short range of time, but they're off and go.
A couple of months.
Right.
So when you say, is there a revival, I tell you, nothing has changed.
Yeah. So what does a playwright do?
Well, most of them are working in regional theaters. Yeah. That's where most of the action is, where they get a production that'll stay on for a couple of weeks, let's say, or a month. The problem in a regional theater is, supposing he writes a play for a man of 55. Well, you know, a man of 55 is not likely to be in a regional theater. And if he is, with all due respect, he probably isn't that great an actor, or by that time he'd have been off someplace else.
New York or Los Angeles.
So the result is we have a lot of active production, and where the plays require more than very young actors, we're in trouble.
Is Death of a Salesman the best thing you ever did?
Well, that depends on what production you're looking at. I've seen the productions of The Crucible. I saw a production of A View from the Bridge at the National Theatre in England, which is as good as anything I ever wrote. That, what's his name, directed...
But we can't just compare it on the page and say, in 1949, Arthur Miller reached up and became a great American playwright, and he has not done that good since then, if you just compare it on the page without looking at the production.
Well, it depends on what you're looking for. For one
Classic American conflict that everybody can relate to, that speaks to all ages, regardless of the decade it's seen.
Some would argue that The Crucible is that play. It's produced about twice as many times as Salesman is.
Yeah. And what would you argue?
Well, in many ways it is more of a universal play, as it turns out. That play has many more productions here and abroad all the time. Yeah. And the reason I think may be that that situation of hysteria and conversion of a little truth into a big lie is pretty universal.
Yeah. But if I injected you with sodium penthol and said, Arthur, which? What would you say?
I honestly wouldn't know what to say to you.
You wouldn't?
No,
now, what do you think your friends would say, those people that you care about, that care about you?
Well, it depends on what they've seen.
And the production they saw.
And if they've seen a hell of a production of some of the others, they'd feel differently.
Why did you become a playwright?
Well, it's an affliction that I often think you're born with. It's I never thought about becoming a playwright or not becoming one. It just seemed to be the natural...
It chose you?
Yeah, I think a playwright is partly an actor, frankly. I didn't used to think that, but I think so now. And you are projecting your acting skills on other characters. The difference with a novelist is usually the novelist is not an actor. So he doesn't hear language, whereas a playwright hears language. the playwriting is an auditory skill rather than a literary one. And
you've got to hear.
You got to hear what you're writing.
The voices. You got to hear the dialogue, and you hear the characters.
Right.
Yeah. Are they there trying to get out?
Well, that's a pleasant fiction. The truth of the matter is that
that's what this is about.
They're not there. I think characters are projections of the author, obviously, and they're different sides of his apprehension of reality.
Someone once said about you, he is at bottom an odd man who happens to hear, then transcribe voices in his head, a shy child of absolute talent.
Well, I don't know who said that, but that's
fair.
The way I feel about the art,
yeah.
Yes. See, if I can't hear it, I can't write it. And if I start to write dialogue that is visual dialogue, that's words on a page, I know I have to quit.
And if, in fact, let's say whoever we feel that we want to put on this pedestal, you and Tennessee Williams and Eugene O'Neill, and then go to other ages and other times, and whether it's Chekhov and Shakespeare and all of the best, regardless of a nationality, what would they share in common, you think? What gift?
Well, I hesitate to say it.
But I don't mean to. Don't be embarrassed by putting yourself in the category of those people.
Well,
but just
I
tell me.
don't do that. But I mean, I understand your question. I personally think that what the big ones have in common is a fierce moral sensibility, which is unquenchable, and that they are all burning with some anger at the way the world is. The littler ones have made a peace with it, and the bigger ones can't make any peace.
And are they fewer today?
You know, who knows? While we're speaking, somebody may be up on some corner, some apartment house now, writing a masterpiece.
With an idea of burning in him or her.
Yeah, it could be. So I'm not prepared to say that it's over at all. I could repeat, boringly, I admit, that the situation in the theater repels that kind of talent.
Because there's no incentive.
See, we blew the audience. The audience for this kind of stuff has become minimal. The prices are too high. A lot of people who would love to go simply cannot go. School teachers, intellectuals, or people who don't make a lot of money.
It's $100 any way you cut it.
It's really insane. You can't expect
by the time you pay to get there and eat dinner and all that. That by itself makes it impossible to speak in the terms I've been speaking. Now, can you argue without being too pompous and pretentious that we are at a loss as a nation because the theater is not alive with the great conflicts of our time and helping us understand who we are and the great dilemmas that we face? And if we were grappling with those issues, both in the theater and in our public dialogue, we'd be better off as a society.
I'm sure of it. But let me just say, we're not really alone in this. You see, the closest related culture to ours is the British, in this sense. And if the British had not established the British National Theatre back in the 50s, they would have exactly the situation we've got, namely a purely commercialized theatre, which cannot take great risks, not because they're not nice fellas, but because the costs are simply beyond what reason would suggest. The British theatre now, the Broadway part of it, the West End, is on the ropes. Why? Because their costs have gone up, and they cannot risk what they used to be able to risk. The National Theatre and the other subsidized theaters, from time to time, are doing marvelous work.
Did you take the ride down Mount Morgan to London first?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It's never been produced here.
Did it make a difference? I mean, was the reception over there different? Do they appreciate American playwrights more?
Oh, they do appreciate American playwrights.
Why is that?
Well, I think for one thing, they've got, let's say, a dozen major newspapers in London. So if one guy says it's the worst thing he's ever seen, another one says, I liked it.
Yeah.
Or another one says, I half liked it.
This is the big question about the singular power of the New York Times, because there's no competing voice.
Right. Well, they have no such thing there. So the consequence is that people are more likely to say, oh, well, it's not a masterpiece, apparently, but they say it's quite interesting. Well, quite interesting here means it's closing tomorrow morning. It can't be quite interesting. It has to be the greatest thing that ever happened. Well, of course.
Well, that's not fair to say, is it? I mean, I've seen.
Well,
you know, I mean, it's that black and white.
They've got to show an enthusiasm, that is, whoever's doing it for the Times, that you cannot miss this.
Yeah.
If he's enthusiastic, but he says you could miss it,
then they won't go.
Finished. Now, if there were 2 other, 3 other, 4 other, 5 other major venues like that, it would be quite different.
Let me take you back to 1940. 47 was the first play, All Fall Down, right?
That was All My Sons.
I mean, All My Sons, All My Sons. That was your first success. Did you know then, I mean, that you were good? Did it fuel, did you say, because you were a young man then, you were in your, what, 20s?
I was about 29,
Yeah.
28. But I had written about 10 plays by that time.
Yeah. But this was then not even the first one that had been produced on Broadway. You had another one on
another
Broadway,
one
and then you written a novel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
But this comes along, and it's Clerman likes it, right?
That was Clerman and Kazan,
And Kazan.
who formed a small company of their
they
own.
liked it. But then 2 years later, you come back with Death of a Salesman. How long was that bumping up in your head?
Probably all my life.
Really?
Sure.
You heard those voices. That Biff was there.
Also, let's not forget something, and that was that I was surrounded with an audience and a culture and a city which had, I don't remember how many newspapers with critics. The area, the atmosphere, rather, was not hostile. I mean, it's not me alone, but any playwright will tell you he feels he's in occupied country, which is not occupied by his troops.
Occupied by whom?
By the enemy.
And the enemy is?
This whole culture. He feels he's really in a corner. And maybe with some miracle, he can squeak through and gain a few yards. Well, this is okay maybe in the automobile business, but in the arts, it's deadly.
But you had nowhere to turn. I mean, this is what you are, a playwright. So you got to deal with it.
I'm still doing it.
Yeah, I know you are, and you're working on something now. Yeah. What's the name of it, and what's the?
It's called The Last Yankee.
What's it about?
It's about the last Yankee.
I mean, who's the last Yankee?
It's about a carpenter and his wife up in New England there.
And you're a carpenter too, aren't you?
Well,
you build
of
furniture.
sorts, yeah.
Live on a farm, build furniture. Any bit of it autobiographical?
Not really, excepting I know.
Yeah. But
I
all
know
of the
those.
characters autobiographical in a way.
Look,
I mean, Lyman was partly.
The question is moot. I mean, you can't even begin. Anybody who writes about what he
knows and
lives
is and
knows.
feels.
Sure.
Yeah. After Death of a Salesman, you went to Los Angeles, right? You about a year later, 1950, you went out there.
I wrote a movie for about the waterfront here.
Yeah. But was it ever made into a film?
Never.
What happened?
Well, we ran into the Cold War.
Yeah.
The movie was called The Hook, and it was about the corruption on the Brooklyn waterfront, where I spent some time. And to make a very complicated story much shorter, Harry Cohn, who wanted very much to do this because Kazan was a director he wanted in his employ, got nervous because the whole Red Scare was starting. So he brought in the FBI to read the script. And the FBI read the script, and worse than that, the head of the unions in the movie industry, Roy Brewer, who was a buddy of the head of the union in New York,
right,
on the waterfront. They were the same stripe. And he proclaimed that all this was a lie, that there was no corruption on the waterfront. And within 2 years, the head of the union that I was writing about was in Sing Sing, in a long stretch for racketeering. But they managed to kill the whole thing.
You met Marilyn then?
Just briefly.
Marilyn Monroe. But you knew her at that time, introduced to her.
Yeah.
And then you corresponded after that?
Hardly, just a little bit.
Yeah. How did you come to know her?
Well, she was working on a film. She had a small part in, I can't remember the name of the film, and I was in that studio just briefly on some business, and I met her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Did she come here to come back to the East for acting because?
Well, she thought she could, she wanted to get out of that career that she was now restless in. She wanted to become a real actress. And she thought she could do it by going to the actor's studio. That was basically why she wanted to do it, be here.
Yeah. And is that when the two of you became?
Yeah.
Much has been, you've written about this too, in your own memoir. Characterize her.
Well, that's difficult at this stage of the game. She was well, how can you put it? She was everything. Whatever anybody was, she had a little of it. And it was a disastrous combination of powerful impulses in every direction.
All within her.
All within the same woman.
Yeah. Arthur Miller, back in a moment. Stay with us. Said nice. Arthur Miller's here. Let me just stay with this period of your life because it also was. You believe that there were these competing demons within her. That she was tough and at the same time vulnerable, and what else?
You name it. It was there.
Yeah. Irresistible as a woman?
She could be. But she was flying apart toward the end.
Smart?
Well, she wasn't smart enough to survive.
Yeah. Wanted power?
Now she wanted to be good.
To be good, which is different, isn't it?
Well, it corresponds sometimes. If you're good, you're powerful.
Yeah. What was the magic between the two of you before you got married?
I know all that.
I know, but stay with me for a second because it is of interest to me. There were, I mean, people said this is East and West. You know, this is brains and beauty. This is
Well, she was as
dark
smart
and light.
as anybody.
Yeah.
She was. See, the problem with her was that nobody could give as sexy a woman as that credit for having any brains.
Even then, especially
Even
then.
then,
Especially
then.
Yeah.
She'd been much better off today.
You believe also that Lee Strasberg was a negative influence.
I think on the whole he was. He made people more dependent upon him.
A kind of guru.
Yeah, you know, there are teachers who try to teach so that the student no longer needs them. And there is a teacher who tries to teach so that the student can never do without him.
Is dependent.
And the second kind, in my opinion, was Lee Strasberg.
Yeah. And she felt like she couldn't do it without.
Oh, you couldn't do anything.
Yeah.
Couldn't do anything. Had to have his wife with her on the set. And she was everything.
Yeah. How do you believe she died?
I haven't a clue.
I mean, do you believe there was foul play, or?
I really don't know any more than I read in the paper.
Yeah. There was suicide, or?
I can't even speculate about it.
Yeah.
Who knows what happened?
What was happening on the Misfit? You were there. It was at the end, and it was terrible conflict.
Well, it was her confidence was difficult to hold on to. She had a terrific responsibility there. So she would feel terribly responsible for it and know that and believe that she wasn't doing it well enough, or that people were not giving her enough help, or whatever.
Back to you. All of us, you can write about this and think about this better than most, want to be doing something professionally at work, whether we are a carpenter building furniture, as you do, a journalist, as I am, a playwright, as you are. At the same time, we want it to be matched by being madly in love. So I guess I want to know, was it a happy time for you?
For a while, but then after a while her dependency was too much. She was ill. Yeah. She was an ill woman.
Ill from dependence on pills or psychological?
Drugs, yes. It was that kind of a dependency.
Yeah. Why couldn't you write during that period?
We're too distracted, I think.
5 years?
Yeah.
Was it therefore when after the fall came, was there a sense of, did you just feel something back inside of you, stirring inside of you, so that and all of a sudden you're hearing voices again?
I was trying to make sense of, any play is an attempt to symbolize events that otherwise would go dispersed into space. And that was exactly the same as my other plays. It's an attempt to find a form for your experience, either real experience or imaginary experience, but you need to feel a development and a rising line of a conflict and a resolution to this, which you can't find in life or rarely find in life. So the play really gives a resolution to what doesn't exist in reality.
Yeah. But why could you finally write it? Because after having been distracted?
Because I could finally confront all the contradictions in myself and in the world that I was with.
Had you made up with Kazan by then? Because you were pretty...
Yes, to a degree, yeah.
At your initiation?
He directed that play.
Yeah.
He was the head of the Lincoln Center at that time.
At your initiation, or his, or
no,
did he come to you?
He and Bob Whitehead came to me.
And said?
Because Whitehead was the producer of the Lincoln Center, the first producer, and they wanted to create what they thought was going to become an American national theater with a core of actors.
The dream that we talked about at the beginning of this conversation.
The old dream. It would be a new group theater, excepting on a bigger scale. Naturally, I was very interested in that because I believe in it.
Yeah.
And that was basically why we got together, because we all believed in the same thing.
After that incident at Vichy?
That was in the same theater.
Same theater, same at Lincoln Center.
That was directed by Harold Clurman.
Yeah, who you'd worked with before.
Yeah. Vichy was an attempt to deal with what I've always felt is the most important single event in this century and maybe ever.
Ever?
Yeah, I think that the destruction of German culture and the transformation of that people into the barbarians that they were is a lesson to us all. And that this is saying to the world, watch out. These people were the most cultivated people in Europe. They were probably the best educated people in Europe, the most socially disciplined people in Europe, in many ways the most progressive people in Europe. And in a space of, well, a couple of years, they were burning people up. And you have to face this in human nature.
Was it because of the malevolence and the, we just had Robert Harris who's written this book that you may call The Fatherland about the
I heard about it.
Basically. And I asked him about that and what it was about them. I mean, it separated them, enabled them to do it, and he talked about the malevolence and the violence and also the political gift that they had, that Goebbels had. And I guess I'm asking one, from your perspective, was it because somehow the German, did it happen because somebody got control of the levers of power and then forced them to do it? Or was there some sense that the German people...
I think, to put it very briefly, too briefly, there is in all of us a retrograde desire to kill, to destroy, a love of the dark. And that we have a lot of forces that keep us from doing it most of the time. Yeah. And that when a leadership arises in a country that believes that it can lead by using the darkness in man, it's probably unstoppable at a certain point.
Really?
Well, we've seen it in more than one place. And that was the perfect...
Stalin in... Yeah. Soviet Union.
The power over others, the willingness to destroy others, is very deep in the human mind.
Character.
Yeah. And, if you've got a regime with the talent that regime had, by talent I mean the industrial talent,
that the administration in power co-opted too, and
right.
used and found willing to serve their ends.
Well, it's it should stop anyone from thinking this is a purely German phenomenon. Unfortunately, a lot of the time it doesn't.
Here's why I'm asking this, without suggesting and by any remote means that there's some correlation and that America is in peril. There are those who say that the American public today is attracted to, I'm being careful with the words, to a Ross Perot because they want somebody that can fix it, that they're so disenfranchised by the gridlock in Washington. They want somebody to fix it. It's not what we're talking about, but it is a sense of saying to someone, come, lead us.
Yes, well, you ask people why if the most alarming thing about that whole phenomenon is that you must have had this experience. You ask people, well, why exactly are you backing this man? And they don't know. I mean, what does he stand for that you like?
And they say, I just don't know. I mean, I know generally, but I believe it doesn't go to his relative merits. It just says that there's a hunger. I mean, someone said to me, the people who are supporting Perot, without making a value judgment about him, are more interesting than Perot, than Perot himself. Mm-hmm. It is, in a sense, he seems like a can-do guy in 1992. Yeah. And somebody, you know, it's so I'm
it's a sign of exhaustion, of course. We're exhausted with trying to figure...
Exhausted with democracy?
Yeah, I'm afraid so. It is a way of skipping over the democratic process and saying, look, just leave it to him, and he'll do it. And he probably is a man of goodwill.
Yeah, right.
And we can't figure everything out, and the best part about him is that he says, look, I don't know the answer. People are attracted to that.
Yeah.
Instead of a man getting up as Clinton and Bush have.
And saying, I've got a program for everything.
I got a program for everything. Well, they know by now that if they did, they would be, they'd be rich. And they don't.
Does it make you pessimistic or optimistic about our future?
I think we're going to live through this. The reason I say that is because this isn't Germany in one respect. This country has many civilizations in it, which the Germans didn't have.
You mean our own heterogeneous quality?
Yeah, I mean, while we're talking about all these important issues of the theater in Texas, they're not talking about that. And in Montana, and in Florida, and Mississippi, they have other things on their minds. So the country never gets to marching together. I remember during the McCarthy period, I went out to Arkansas, Fayetteville, and I lectured. I made a speech.
University of Arkansas.
Yeah, and at the end, the faculty sat around, and McCarthy was, I thought, really was going to take over the government any week, and everybody's running around terrified here, and in Washington, Chicago, Los Angeles, and they sat around. The faculty sat around and said, "Now, what about this McCarthy?" I said, well, what about him? And they said, why is everybody so afraid of him? And I thought, well, this country's going to survive. They hadn't a clue. They wondered what is so frightening about this guy.
But why did you think the country was going to survive when they said that? Because it would seem to me that I would be maybe even more scared if they said this somebody's coming along who had the qualities that Joe McCarthy did, and people weren't concerned about it. I might say, well,
they were concerned, but they weren't frightened of him.
Yeah, meaning that we can handle this.
This
guy gets out of line.
Yeah. It's a totally different culture. They may as well have been in a different country.
Yeah. There's a resilience, and we know right and wrong, and right will prevail.
There was a uniformity in Germany that doesn't exist here. And at the moment, now, I'm not making nothing of it. I think it's a very important development because at the moment, Perot is a symbol of this skipping over of the democratic process in people's minds. For everything I can see, he's a bit of an authoritarian, I think, from the way he sounds. But I'm not sure that this is going to end up in a disaster. The thing is that it could with somebody else who is setting himself up to know, to contain the authority. I think it's authority people want. We've got very weak leaders. We've had leaders who were including...
uninspiring.
I think including Reagan, who really was a man who wasn't there. Everybody knew he wasn't there. They sensed he wasn't there. That's what they liked about him. In fact, that's what he said he was doing. He was going to get the government off the back.
I would argue that that's not what they liked about him. What they liked about him is he seemed...
just like them.
That's right. And that's what he said his genius was. He said that.
Yeah.
He said,
well, he was right.
I'm just like them. That's what... And he also said, though, he understood, I think, I mean, Lou Cannon, who has written a terrific, first-rate biography called, I think, The Role of a Lifetime, Ronald Reagan, and it's the role of a lifetime. He understood the carrying and the carriage and the bearing of all those symbols of leadership, which you understand, too. I mean, it was the way he somehow, if you can somehow crystallize and articulate, you know, the pulse of a nation. I mean, the way, even though it came from a speechwriter, he was the person who articulated at the time of the shuttle went down. You know, the way he used Peggy Noonan's words, it expressed the sentiment, you know,
well, he had a great feel for the ordinary person.
But that says something, doesn't it? I mean, that's a quality of leadership.
Sure. Maybe
more important even than a knowledge of every
program. It is the important thing as far if you want to be a leader.
Yeah.
It is the important thing. See, when Roosevelt came in, everybody's forgotten, he came in as a conservative.
Yeah.
He came in preaching a balanced budget.
Right.
Everybody's forgotten this. He wasn't coming in to spend all this money on WPA and welfare and the rest of it. Far from it. He was a conservative, rich man.
Yeah, going to get the country moving again.
Right. And within 8-10 months, he realized that the whole thing was going down the tubes unless something very different was done, namely to start spending some money. And that it violated all the tenets of his original election.
But also what Roosevelt had that was genius was, I mean, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. It was the sense
that was the leadership.
That was leadership.
And
that was confidence.
Leadership. And by the way, Perot has got a similar kind of attitude that there is no problem we can't solve.
Yeah. But that's what a country needs, does it not?
It sure does.
And that's what we've been missing.
It sure does.
And that's why everybody's upset, because they think somehow we've lost that quality as a nation. Right. They look at the competition from Japan and they look at the competition from Germany, and they say, you know, whatever happened to the America I knew, right? I don't know whether, is that healthy, or should we be more realistic and say this is a new world? And
well, I wish to God that somebody would be talking about the issues instead of making these poetic statements about what I can do and what I'm going to do, and issues like how do you start to educate this population so that they can even run the machines that you got.
Who's the best public politician you've ever met? Who do you admire the most? Roosevelt?
Well, he was the matrix that they were all trying to imitate. Yeah. You know, Ronald Reagan he was acting Roosevelt.
Right. Roosevelt was his hero.
Yes, he was. Roosevelt was the man of our era. He was the fella who they all have to. Kennedy was doing
Yeah, I
the
was
same
going to ask you
thing.
about Kennedy. Tell me about Kennedy. Did you know him? Did you
Well,
know
I
him?
met him a couple of times. Yeah, I can't say that I knew him, but I wasn't mad about him. It took me a little while to vote for him because I felt he was a hawk. I felt he was going to get us into a war. I felt he was elitist. I didn't like the smell of it.
I just had David McCullough here talking about Harry Truman in a conversation, and he said Truman thought he was too young and too inexperienced.
That
for the
he
job.
himself was too young.
Yeah, he said that Truman felt like Jack Kennedy.
Yeah.
President Kennedy was too young at the time and didn't
Oh, yeah.
support him.
Mm.
You know, supported Stuart Symington or others at the
Well,
time.
at the time, it seemed a dubious
He was
thing.
like 43 years old.
Yeah, it seemed it was a little too stylish for me.
Yeah. Who'd you like, Stevenson?
I don't like Stevenson was about the best of the men.
Brains, wit.
Yeah, but he made terrible speeches.
Did he really?
Everybody used to say he was a great speaker, but you know, my father was the best judge of these things.
Yeah.
He was Mr. America. And one night, Stevenson came on and made a speech. He was running against Eisenhower. And then Eisenhower came on. And after Stevenson came on, I said to my father, well, what do you think? My father was Democrat, of course. And he said, oh, he's very nice. When Eisenhower came on and said, I will go to Korea.
Yeah.
The Korean War was
Leadership.
I said, what do you think? He said, well, I can understand him. And if you look at Stevenson's speeches, read them, they are so prolix. The sentence structure is so involved. They aren't good speeches. They're good reading,
Yeah.
but the ear wasn't there. And he loved these elliptical statements, which read so well, but when you try to, they were rather Germanic sentences. You know, the end, by the time you got to the end, you forgot what the beginning was. I didn't think he was good at all.
Is it fair to say that somewhere today, somewhere in the world, Death of a Salesman is being produced and The Crucible is being produced? Probably.
Oh, no doubt about it.
Yeah, somewhere. And the Chinese response didn't surprise you, but surprised a lot of people.
You know, the Chinese invented the family. The whole idea of the family was the center of the world.
Yeah.
They also invented business. And when I went there...
So they understood a salesman, even though people said they'll never get it because they don't understand what a salesman is.
After all, in the 6,000-year history of China, the communists had ruled from 1950, roughly, till now. What is that? That's like the blink of an eye.
Yeah.
It's
a small amount of time,
It's nothing. So when people said, well, they're never going to understand it, indeed, at the American embassy at that time, most of them said they're never going to get this, you know, they're very primitive, the audience. Mm-hmm. Except one guy who was the political officer. His job was to understand the politics of China. And he took me aside, he says, don't worry about it for 1 minute. They'll get it. There's nothing in here they won't get. However, the style of the play was completely strange to them. But once they got past that,
they got it.
Sure.
Yeah, because it's human nature.
They're playing it again now, in fact.
Right. Arthur Miller's here. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
But you don't hear people walking around talking.
Now, let me
about
just
this.
let the audience at home, our friends at home, I just looked at this week's Newsweek, and I said, Private Lives, How the Fairy Tale Unraveled. I said, why are we so fascinated by this? And you said, we are, but they aren't.
Yeah.
My impression is they are. mean,
I would argue about that. I don't think that they're as madly interested as we are.
Yeah.
In the
Yeah, let me
one thing, they're there all the time.
Yeah.
After all,
Right.
If you pick up a British paper, you'll find that one of them is doing something every day of the week. Yeah. They're at an orphanage, or they're, riding a bicycle, or whatever it is.
Yeah, see, I don't. I mean, I'm fascinated by. I mean, I don't know how I feel about it. I am fascinated, and there is some about Marilyn Monroe. Somehow what she represents in America, and Gloria Steinem and Norma Mailer, and you in a very real way, and as journalists and writers, they've been fascinated by. I have 1,000 questions. It is only respect partial respect for your privacy that prevents me to asking you, was she the most beautiful woman? A lot of other questions. What was she like? All of that. I have less curiosity about this. I don't really care about what he's like or what she's like, except that is this the end of the monarchy, and does this imperil the monarchy? That's an interesting question for me.
Yeah, I think it probably is going to shake itself down now if they all get divorced.
Yeah.
Because it's the Church of England, he is the head of the Church of England.
Of course, I know.
And if he's going to be...
Or he will be if he becomes king.
The Church of England forbids divorce just as much as the Catholic Church.
Yeah. Well, the latest I heard is they're probably going to patch it up because they understand what's at stake.
Oh, yeah, they will, sure. I'm sure they will.
Can you imagine doing anything other than writing?
Well, yeah, I could.
What?
I would have loved to farm.
Really?
Yeah. But I wouldn't want to do it in an area where you had to clear a lot of rocks out of the land, which is what I have. I love the land.
Yeah. But
however,
you'd want to be a farmer, but you'd also want to be a philosopher and
yeah. Well, the way Jefferson was a farmer. Yeah. It can be done.
Yeah. You like seeing things grow.
Yeah, and there's a lot of wonderful, interesting work and breeding plants and all that.
You know what I like about it, too, is the notion of the people somehow connected to the land. I mean, I can romanticize this probably more than it deserves, but it is the notion of people who somehow are connected and what their whole life is dependent on and relative to what happens between the land and themselves. It makes them different somehow.
Yeah. See, for one thing...
There's the seasons, and there's the rain, and there's the elements, and there are the insects, and all of those things are a factor, and they're very real things.
Well, for one thing, in order to do that kind of work, they have to be more or less able to do all kinds of other techniques, like welding now. Mm-hmm. They have to know about metals, they have to know about wood, they have to know about weather, soil, 1,000 things to do with the machinery.
You could never have been a screenwriter. Could you have been a successful
I wouldn't have lasted very long, because the idea of writing something and it is owned when you write it by somebody else offends my private enterprise feelings. But basically, I want to be able to stop something when I don't feel it's going. See, if you're a screenwriter, you've got to go to the end. You stop marching, and you've got to go down to the end with it. And there are too many other voices in there. I would get exhausted. I would get so tired, I would fall asleep listening to them.
And what about novels?
Well, a novel, it's a different story, of course. It's yours until you give it away.
But why haven't you written more then?
It always seems Actually, I have written a long story which is presently being published, and about 70 pages, and I'm writing another one, which is be a little longer. They'll be like short novellas. Mm-hmm. I love to write prose.
Yeah. Saul Bellow did that. Wrote some short novellas.
Well, it's got a long history.
Yeah.
I love to do that, but it's not quite the same charge as when you're writing a scene in the play. It is the naked truth, to me, is in a set of speeches so that between the lines it's exploding all the time. You don't find that in prose very much, and you don't find it in theater either very much, but you can do it in the theater.
Are you born with that talent? I mean,
I used to think so. Of course, now they teach playwriting all over the place.
Right, especially at Yale and places like that.
But what I call a play is very often not what other people call a play.
How does it differ?
Well, I think my idea of a play is that it is intensely integrated, so that literally one thing forces the next thing to happen. There can be nothing arbitrary in it. But this is a kind of a rigorous scheme which a lot of people no longer are interested in. They want effusions. They want color. And they are not necessarily interested in the gradual development of a theme in a musical sense.
Do you think you're every bit as good as you were when you wrote at the beginning, when you had such enormous success at the beginning?
Who knows? I feel
I mean, is the skill there? I mean, just in your judgment, not in anybody else's.
The skill is there. It's just that as you grow older, of course, you have to fend off the realization that this is not going to change the world.
Yeah.
Which was the illusion you started with. And furthermore, in this particular theater, that we're in the New York theater, you have to blot out of your mind completely what this theater is like. The surround of hostility here.
Otherwise, it'll be defeating of your esteem and sense of...
Well, it becomes fruitless.
Incentive. It'll destroy your incentive.
Yeah. See, for example, if I write a wonderful part, and you can't get actors to play it for more than 2 or 3 months.
Yeah. Well, now, you know, some people step forward, as you know, and say, well, that's because Mr. Miller hasn't written anything that anybody wants to do, or something like that.
Well, excepting they all say they want to do.
So he's transferring to the entire community what his own.
Well, try 11 other playwrights and see what answer
you think I'd get the same answer?
Sure.
Yeah.
Look, it makes sense from the actor's point of view. The price is on Broadway, and they're making $750 a week. Any one of those actors working in television or on film would work the same amount of time for several $100,000, if not more.
Right.
So you're asking them to support the theater.
Make a huge sacrifice.
They are supporting the theater.
Yeah. And it makes sense only if it does something in addition for...
Right. So why should they do it?
All right. Any great regrets? I mean, you're still, look to me like you're in damn good shape. But as you look at your life, any great regrets?
Yeah, I have a lot of them, but I don't want to discuss
Well, just
them.
give me one, the biggest one.
I suppose that this doesn't sound much like a regret, except it is. I feel that had I been connected with a real theater, there would have been twice as many players. Sounds crazy, but I think so.
It would have been an incentive. It would have been creative. It would have stimulated.
It would have
the
been
juices.
in a friendly atmosphere, which the people who wanted your stuff, rather than a group of gamblers, really, who are looking at this and saying, "Well, can we make our money back? Twice, double, triple, just about."
If you knew it had a home, you would have been more.
Absolutely.
You would have been more
Absolutely.
moved to get up in the morning and go out to your study.
Well, you'd figure
right away.
You know, there's a British playwright, what's his name, who he's written about 35 plays now. He just had one here, A Small Family Business. You know.
Alan Ayckbourn?
Ayckbourn.
Right.
He solved it. See, he established a small theater up in a small town that he comes from, 40, 50 miles away from London. He's got a nice, tidy little audience there. But he writes a kind of a play which is perfectly admirable, but it's not my kind of a play. But nevertheless, by the way, he directed that marvelous production of A View from the Bridge in London, which was the last thing I would ever have dreamed he would ever do.
And what would you most like for your colleagues to say about you?
You know, a long time ago, there was a playwright named Sidney Howard, who's all but forgotten now. He was a very good writer. And somebody asked him that same question. And I think probably he gave the ultimate answer. He said, say just that I wrote some damn good parts.
Thank you. Pleasure. Good to have you. Arthur Miller, we thank you for sharing this time with us. See you next time.